Are you ready to learn the truth about the greatest strategic failure in the history of an entire continent?
This empire possessed boundless resources, massive armies, and a well-established system of control over millions of subjects.
Their cities amaze the imagination with their intricate architecture, long stone dams, and endless, bustling markets.
However, this colossal machine of power collapsed under the onslaught of a tiny band of foreigners because of its own unbreakable rules.
Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how blind faith in bureaucracy and fear of breaking traditions destroyed the most powerful state. What if I told you that everything you believed about the power of this empire is a lie? The system of governing the vast capital was built on an extremely rigid hierarchy, where every decision had to go through dozens of lengthy approvals. Local rulers had no right to act without a direct order from the Supreme Council and the Supreme Leader. The idea of completely destroying the enemy's infrastructure or economy seemed to them to lack practical sense. They were accustomed to dictating their terms to the vanquished, leaving their cities intact for the subsequent collection of tribute.
This limited approach to waging conflict made them vulnerable to those who fought for the complete conquest of territories.
The massive army defending the capital was divided into numerous specialized units with unique functions. Coordination between these units was carried out using complex visual signals and sound instruments. When lines of communication were severed, individual units often lost sight of the overall strategic picture of the battle. Field commanders lacked the authority to independently change tactics without approval from above. Such centralized command turned a formidable army into a cumbersome machine in the face of rapidly changing circumstances. Communication between provinces was facilitated by a network of wide stone roads and professional couriers. These runners could deliver information over vast distances in an incredibly short time. However, the information itself was often distorted at every stage of the bureaucratic chain. Local governors downplayed negative news, fearing the wrath of the supreme ruler in the capital. As a result, the empire's leader often received an inaccurate picture of what was happening in the physical state. The complexity of the capital's architecture also played a role in the Please share your thoughts in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Guess what happened next when huge floating structures with white sails appeared on the horizon? Local observers immediately reported to the capital about the arrival of unseen ships and strange people in shining armor. Instead of immediately putting the defenders on high alert, the ruler convened a council for a lengthy discussion of the situation. The envoys were instructed simply to observe and deliver gifts, attempting to appease the strangers with riches and exquisite food.
This decision became the first fatal mistake in the chain of events that led to a complete loss of control.
Time that could have been spent strengthening the defensive lines was wasted on endless divination ceremonies. A vast state voluntarily ceded the strategic initiative to a handful of self-assured newcomers. As they approached the capital, tension within the empire's government apparatus grew exponentially. The ruler found himself trapped by his own orders for peaceful observation, which were now difficult to revoke. A sharp change in political course required lengthy consultations with the elite, who were themselves paralyzed by fear. Society began to doubt the authority of a leader unable to provide a clear response to an external challenge. The wasted precious time arguing over the guest's status, instead of fortifying strategic roads and dams.
This moment became the starting point for a massive political crisis that engulfed the entire vast continent.
Do you think another ruler in his place could have made a tougher decision in the early days? Watch the video until the next chapter, and you'll learn how the stranger's diplomacy managed to destroy centuries-old alliances. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about is that the empire was surrounded by discontented vassals. For decades, the mighty capital had imposed an unbearably heavy tribute on neighboring independent cities. The central government demanded constant shipments of gold, rare cotton, building materials, and food. This harsh economic policy bred immense hidden resentment among the leaders of the subordinate provinces. Outsiders quickly recognized this vulnerability and began actively exploiting the discontent of local elites to their advantage. In some cities, the outsiders deliberately provoked conflicts between local factions to strengthen their influence.
They supported those rulers who promised them the greatest loyalty and resources.
This divide and conquer policy proved incredibly effective in the complex local political landscape. Ancient grievances between neighboring settlements flared up with renewed intensity, completely destroying the regional security system. The capital found itself surrounded by a tight ring of hostile territories, cut off from its main supply lines. The newcomers' diplomacy was built on promises of a bright future, free from the capital's heavy taxes. They skillfully played on feelings of pride and independence that had been suppressed by the central authority for centuries. Local leaders sincerely believed that after defeating the capital, they would gain their long-awaited freedom. They did not realize that they were simply replacing one dictator with another, one far more pragmatic and calculating. This fatal misconception became the key factor ensuring the success of the entire foreign campaign. The foreigners' diplomatic victories completely shifted the strategic balance of power across the vast territory surrounding the capital.
Yesterday's vassals now voluntarily provided the visitors with their knowledge of the terrain and provisions for safe passage.
The system of control, built on coercion, began to crumble at the very first appearance of an alternative center of influence. This historical paradox shows how strong internal discontent destroys even the strongest stone walls from within. If you enjoy this kind of in-depth analysis of historical events, please be sure to like this video. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how easily an entire state can be seized without large-scale clashes? The strangers entered the island capital not as conquerors, but as honored guests of the supreme ruler. They proceeded along the wide causeway straight into the heart of the vast city, marveling at its pristine cleanliness. The ruler personally greeted them at the main gates, observing all the ancient protocols of hospitality and respect. Millions of residents watched this peaceful procession, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of the end of their empire. The guests were housed in a massive stone palace that had belonged to the father of the current head of state. This building stood in the very center of the city, next to the main administrative and religious structures. This period marked the height of absurdity in the history of the capital's complex diplomacy and bureaucracy. A vast city with hundreds of thousands of armed defenders peacefully tolerated the presence of a tiny group of occupiers. The rules created to preserve stability became the primary instrument for destroying that very stability. The inertia of the capital's elite prevented them from recognizing the deadly threat of time and taking decisive action. The clockwork of an inevitable catastrophe had set in motion, and it was now completely impossible to stop. Having lost its true leader, the empire's complex administrative apparatus simply ceased to function. The ruler's orders were now transmitted under the strict control of outsiders, who exploited his authority with its goal. The city continued its normal life from a quiet catastrophe unfolded in the palace. Why didn't the palace's massive elite guard attempt to free their leader? Watch the video until the next chapter, and you'll learn how social tensions in the city had irreversible consequences. The situation in the vast lakeside capital was rapidly deteriorating due to constant pressure from uninvited guests. Demands for more gold jewelry were depleting the city's reserves and causing simmering resentment among the local nobility. The appointed governors tried to maintain the usual order, but their authority waned with each passing day of the stranger's stay. The discontent of ordinary citizens was constantly fueled by the urgent behavior He attempted to use the captive ruler as a last resort to calm the raging mob. The invaders faced a terrifying choice: to slowly starve to death behind the walls or to attempt a breakthrough. Realizing there was absolutely no hope, their leader decided on an immediate secret evacuation from the palace. They began preparing portable wooden bridges to cross the destroyed sections of the city's embankments. Every detail of the retreat was planned under conditions of extreme stress and constant external pressure. It was a moment of utmost tension when the slightest mistake threatened the complete failure of the entire grand campaign. The citizens' outrage erupted into a massive strategic uprising that instantly engulfed all the central districts. The cobblestone streets filled with angry people demanding the immediate departure of the outsiders from their homeland. The ruler tried to calm the crowd from the palace balcony, but he had completely lost the respect of his disillusioned subjects. His words were drowned out by the noise of the invading square, and the authority of the supreme power was completely irrelevant. The city plunged into chaos, and the guests found themselves locked in their residence with no chance of peaceful retreat. What I am about to show you will completely overturn your understanding of tactical retreat planning. Realizing the utter hopelessness of the situation, the strangers decided to secretly leave the besieged palace under the cover of a heavy night rain. They loaded themselves down with gold bars and heavy jewels, which made their movement extremely slow and clumsy. The retreat along the narrow stone causeways quickly turned into a massive disaster when the night city patrols raised the alarm. This moment became the most severe test for the system, which suddenly had a chance to regain full control. The aliens' plan was to advance unnoticed along the shortest causeway, leading to the safe shore. They carried a portable wooden bridge to cross sections where the defenders had destroyed the deck. However, heavy artillery, horses, and chests of looted gold slowed the entire column down considerably. The capital celebrated its victory, unaware that the retreating enemy had merely paused to rethink its strategy. That night, dubbed the Night of Sorrow by the invaders, was merely a prelude to a real, even more terrible tragedy. Having regained control of the city, the new ruler faced the colossal task of repairing the infrastructure. The destroyed dams required immediate restoration to resume the normal supply of food to the vast metropolis. The streets had to be cleared, and the administrative apparatus restarted after a long period of occupation. The government tried to return to business as usual, ignoring the fact that the world around them had changed irrevocably. This illusion of victory lulled the defenders into complacency, depriving them of the incentive for radical reforms. The retreating invaders, despite their monstrous losses, preserved what mattered most: their core leadership and their thirst for revenge. They reached the territories of their royal allies, where they were able to rest and heal their wounds. Their leader began to devise a new plan of action, completely abandoning the idea of a swift diplomatic takeover. He realized that the lake fortress could only be taken through a systematic and ruthless siege of attrition. The stakes in this political game had risen to the maximum, leaving no room for compromise. The retreat resulted in colossal losses of gold, equipment, and political influence across a vast region. The fugitives miraculously reached the safe shore, leaving behind destroyed bridges and their incredible ambitions. This event went down in history as the moment of ultimate triumph for the city's defenders over their confidence. Why do you think the victims did not continue the pursuit and allow the remnants of the force to flee into the mountains? Watch the video until the next chapter, and you'll learn how invisible threats shifted balance of power more effectively than steel weapons. After successfully driving out the strangers, the capital sank into a strange, deeply unsettling lull. The vast city began to experience an invisible exhaustion that slowly but surely sapped the strength of its defenders. The streets rapidly emptied, and the once bustling markets closed due to a severe shortage of labor and experienced managers. The food supply system, which depended on the precise coordination of thousands of people, suffered a critical and massive breakdown. The empire faced an enemy against whom strong walls and long spears were utterly useless. The city's defenders, suffering from a severe shortage of food and manpower, were unable to repair the destroyed defensive structures. Breaches in the dams remained gaping, and new fortifications were being built too slowly due to a lack of workers. The new ruler, the third in a short span of time, found himself facing an impossible historical task. He had to defend a vast but exhausted city than all previous clashes combined. New rulers succeeded one another too quickly, unable to establish an effective line of defense. The loss of experienced administrators led to the breakdown of vital state mechanisms throughout the valley. The capital found itself cut off from its provinces, which could no longer supply the necessary logistical resources. The once great empire had turned into a besieged fortress, awaiting its inevitable and tragic end. Meanwhile, the exiled wasted no time and regrouped the multiple allies. They had learned their lesson from the crushing defeat at the dams and decided to completely overhaul their strategy for capturing the Aztecs. Far from the capital, they began a massive construction project of collapsible sturdy sailboats. These maneuverable vessels were intended to give them complete control of the besieged city. Preparations were carried out with remarkable methodical precision, depriving the defenders of any chance of receiving logistical support from outside. The fleet in the mountains was an unprecedented engineering feat that turned the entire course of the military campaign on its head. Wooden components were crafted by local artisans under the strict supervision of the siege of the capital turned into the methodical destruction of the entire complex urban infrastructure, block by block. The defenders showed incredible resilience, stubbornly defending every street, every canal, and every stone building. However, the invaders employed a tactic of total destruction, filling the canals with the rubble of houses to advance their troops. The vast and beautiful city was being wiped off the face of the earth, turning into a flat plain of stone and dust. Magnificent architecture, built over centuries, crumbled under the methodical pressure of an extremely calculated siege. The attackers' advance was slow, as every intersection turned into a separate fortified stronghold of resistance. The defenders used the roofs of surviving buildings to launch massive attacks from above, pelting the enemies with heavy stones. Administrative chaos prevented the effective distribution of the remaining scraps of food and arrows. The city's defenses disintegrated into hundreds of isolated pockets of resistance, doomed to methodical suppression. As the siege ring tightened, the defenders retreated into increasingly remote and cramped neighborhoods. Overcrowding in these remaining areas became unbearable, exacerbating the effects of the logistical blockade. The lack of clean water and sanitation turned the last pockets of defense into a zone of utter social disaster. People continued to fight on sheer enthusiasm, drawing strength from despair and hatred for the invaders. But physical exhaustion took its toll, making the resistance increasingly weak and disorganized. In these final days of the siege, the system of government ceased to exist in any formal sense. There were no longer judges, tax collectors, or priests. There were only exhausted people awaiting their end. The hierarchy that had defined the lives of every citizen for centuries dissolved into the smoke and dust of the ruined neighborhoods. Equality had come to the capital in the most terrifying of all possible forms. As a total, universal collapse, a great civilization was coming to an end, buried beneath the rubble of its own ambitions and rigid rules. The last line of defense was breached when the combined forces of the attackers launched a decisive offensive. The defenders were unable to hold their positions due to the complete exhaustion of their material and physical reserves. The defense crumbled, turning organized resistance into a chaotic flight among the few remaining escape routes. The invaders occupied the last surviving neighborhoods, gaining complete control over what remained of the magnificent lakeside capital. The long and exhausting siege had raised its volume and devastating condition. The defenders were pushed back to the city's most remote district, where they continued their hopeless resistance. The lack of clean drinking water and food sapped their physical strength, but did not break their stubborn resolve. The structure of society had completely collapsed, leaving only the instinct to preserve their Every destroyed building became a symbol of the passing era of a great and highly complex civilization. The dead walls protracted and the depletion of the city's last reserves. The final chord of this historical drama sounded when the empire's last ruler was intercepted on the lake. His attempt to flee the ruined city in a light canoe was thwarted by the besiegers' agile patrol boats. With the loss of its legitimate leader, organized resistance in the ruins of the capital ceased forever. A heavy, oppressive silence, the silence of a massive catastrophe now fully realized, descended upon the once bustling, spacious squares. The great machinery of governance, which had kept millions of people in fear, finally ceased to exist. The ruler's capture marked the official fall of the greatest empire on the entire continent. The invaders celebrated, having gained control over vast territories and what they believed to be untold riches. However, disappointment awaited them, as most of the city's treasures had been irretrievably lost or hidden. The ruined city could no longer serve as a source of income, requiring colossal investments for its restoration. The occupiers were left with a wasteland on which they would have to build an entirely new system of governance. The victors immediately set about redrawing the entire political map of the region they had conquered. The invaders' former allies, who had hoped for freedom, quickly realized the monstrous strategic mistake they had made. The new regime introduced an even harsher system of taxation and control than the one that had existed under the empire. Independent cities were stripped of their autonomy and subordinated to a new centralized apparatus controlled from afar. The dream of independence dissolved under the new laws dictated by men in steel armor. In place of the ruined stone pyramids and palaces, buildings began to rise in a completely different architectural style. The new capital was built according to European standards, symbolizing a complete break with the cultural heritage of the past. Engineering structures such as dams and aqueducts were partially restored, but now to serve the needs of the new administration. The lake, which had served as a natural defense for the ancient city, was gradually drained to expand the area available for construction. The physical landscape of the region changed just as rapidly as its social structure. The outsiders did not win because they possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers or resources. They won thanks to their political flexibility, willingness to take risks, and ability to exploit their opponents' weaknesses. Their strategy was pragmatic and ruthless, devoid of the ceremonial conventions that tied the hands of the capital's defenders. They used the empire's own system against it, turning its hierarchy into an instrument of destruction. This intellectual and logistical triumph forever altered the course of world history. The silence over the lake valley became an epitaph for a civilization that could not transcend its own dogmas. The vast stone ruins long served as a reminder of the grandeur that had collapsed under the weight of its own inflexibility. The peoples inhabiting this region began a long and arduous journey of adaptation to entirely new realities of life. The fall of the capital set in motion an irreversible process of change across the entire continent for centuries to come. The conquerors began to build their own city on the ruins of the stone palaces of the defeated empire. The new rulers brought their own rules, laws, and administrative system, completely erasing the legacy of the great past. This story of dazzling grandeur and rapid collapse served as a harsh lesson about the high price of inflexibility and fear. The vast state did not lose because of a lack of strength, but because of its inability to change its own rules at a critical moment. Do you think the empire could have survived if it had shown greater diplomatic flexibility at the very beginning of the conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments, as your opinion helps us create more in-depth historical analyses. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new in-depth videos about the mysteries of the past. See you in our next historical investigations.